Greetings to everybody. Greetings. Let's see if I can get my webcam to zero in here. There it goes. It finally takes a while to... Not that I'm going to be a fashion plate when it's sub-zero. Greetings to everybody. Apparently some of you didn't see the email from me last night, or I suspect you wouldn't be here. What has happened is that I am webcasting at the same time, and I sent everybody a link so that if you needed to or wanted to, you could watch this from your room. Yeah. Don't you wish you'd have seen that email? Because it's so bad out there that I was very concerned that some of you may have medical conditions or other issues that I didn't want you to have to come here unless it was absolutely necessary for some reason to see me in person. So if you did want to come to my office hours after class, I will be here. But otherwise, I was hoping that everybody could sort of take advantage of the webcast. If you have any difficulties with the webcast, I'm on an Ethernet connection, so it should be good for those of you watching in your rooms. If you have any difficulties seeing the webcast, there may be a delay because of advertisements and so forth. I will be putting up a YouTube link. I'll send it to you by noon. So I'll take this lecture and I will put it up on YouTube so you can watch it there. We were originally today going to have a lecture by Bill Castanier, and he was going to come in and talk about books. But I did not want to do that to Bill, so I was afraid he'd never speak to me again if I made him come in when it's sub-zero weather. So what we've done is we've switched lectures. I was going to start with newspapers on Thursday, but I'm going to start with the newspaper lecture today and talk a bit about newspapers. We'll return to books then on Thursday, and so those of you, and I know there were some in the room who are writing manuscripts or who are interested in writing books, make sure to get here on Thursday. It'll be a heat wave. We'll be all the way up close to 20, I think. Wow. That's just about bikini weather at MSU these days. So make sure to come on Thursday and see Bill Castanier. That won't change our online quizzes. Those will remain the same. Remember, each week you have to tap in now and do your discussion forum, and you have to do your quiz by Monday morning at 8 o'clock. So don't forget to do that. Today we are going to plunge into the issue of newspapers. And as it says in your book, it goes from newspapers to, let me see if it's still staying in. Oops, we've lost our focus here for a minute. Let me change the webcam and see if I can make this a bit better. Is it going to zero in? Sometimes it has difficulty knowing what to focus on. There we go. Not terribly attractive angle, but I think it's better than what we had. Today we're going to be talking about newspapers. And remember, when we start any new medium, it would be maybe easier for the people in the class. I can't log in. There are difficulties sometimes with the server, and apparently they're having trouble with the server this morning, so I can't log in and show the slides up on the screen. But for those of you who either have a cell phone or a laptop, the PowerPoint is available and you can pull it up there. But we always introduce each new topic, each new medium, by talking a bit about the sort of frame that we use for our discussion. That it requires some level of technological innovation, in this case, tech innovation that relates to news and in newspapers, to be able to enjoy this new medium, and that as the technology improves, it increases access to that information, which means that we're seeing the democratization of information. In other words, information is not just in the hands of a narrow elite, but it is able to filter through greater and greater proportions and layers and classes of the whole society as it becomes more affordable. And that those are influenced by the role of government regulation. Government sometimes tries to censor or change things, or it tries to facilitate, as we're going to see with newspapers. Again, just as we saw with books, they can have a special rate where they, for example, with their postal rates, they have special postal rates that made it easier for people to ship newspapers to people, mail them to them so that they could have the spread of newspapers in the United States. Then there's also the role of the market. If nobody has enough money to buy it, or if the item that you are producing is not popular enough to generate enough income to stay in business, the role of the marketplace plays a role in whether newspapers are going to survive. So in this case, we're really looking at the invention of the printing press as being the technological innovation that led to the production of newspapers. And originally they were just sort of single sheet broadsheets that you would run off by hand on a printing press and maybe hand out and sell for a few pennies on the street someplace. And that was the beginning of the newspaper business in the United States. Originally, as we're going to see, it was very much a mercantile press. It was ideally suited to telling people when the ship from England was going to come in, and you might be able to pick up your new supply of linens or china that was coming in, or the new things that you needed for your business. So it played that kind of role. And as the newspaper business expanded and grew in the United States, it meant that more and more people had access to information, to a wide variety of information. Newspapers went from covering the mercantile news, the business news, to covering a wide variety of different kinds of information. As we see in the full-blown great newspaper eras, it had everything from a column on chess and comics to front page news on the local community, on the state, international news, business news, labor news, lifestyle news. They used to call them the women's pages, then they called them the lifestyle pages. Might have recipes, things about food. They were trying to give a variety of information, a broad variety of information, so that almost everyone who was able to purchase a newspaper could find something in it that interested them. Research tended to show that people had their favorite columnists, that's why they bought the newspaper, or they bought it to get the sports scores, but it had everything in it, and it was all bundled together in one big package. And so that was what happened to the newspapers. Government regulation played a role, and the market played a role, and we'll talk a bit about that. Switch. The definition that we see in the handouts is that, this is the old definition, a newspaper is, quote, a daily or weekly publication on folded sheets. It contains news and articles and advertisements. That was the kind of definition that we used when I started doing this class many years ago, but in the digital age, I'm not sure that that still works very well anymore. Let me move that camera one more time, see if I can get this organized a bit better. There, now I don't, I think that'll work a little bit better. Let's see if it'll finally zero in. There we go. That's good. I think the biggest thing that we're talking about when we're talking about the digital revolution and how it has impacted newspapers, and obviously we know that computers and the digital world has impacted every medium that we've talked about and will talk about. It's the unbundling of the news. Unbundling. Let me see if I can get that. Let me give it one more try to see if I can get in on the, and put the slides up on the, I feel sorry for everybody that showed up in person. I don't want you to miss this if I can, but it just keeps spinning and it doesn't let me into my files on the main computer. You'd think if we go through all the trouble of getting here on a day like today, they'd make sure the server was working properly. Unfortunately, when there's this orange button up there, that usually means that the server is not functioning properly. Well, I guess we just won't be able to get in. The unbundling of the news. What does it mean to unbundle the news? It means all those wonderful little things that I told you a newspaper ultimately started to contain. Once you invent the computer, it can all fly apart. They can all become separate publications. If you're interested in sports, you go to a sports site. If you're interested in international news, you go to a site that specializes in that. If you're interested in local news, you go to a hyper-local site that gives you a lot more local news than your newspaper might ever have been able to do. If you're interested in the comics, you can go to all kinds of places, including animations and flash cartoons and wonderful cartoons that you can see online. If you're interested in the chess column that used to be there, or the one on bridge, you can go to a website where you can play bridge, or you can play chess with other people online. So what has happened to the newspaper in the digital era is that it has literally blown apart. So many of the publications that were trying to be all things to all people now had to figure out how they would reinvent themselves and make them relevant in a digital age. So keep that in mind as we look through the history of the newspaper. Let's see. We're talking also here, and we're talking about the impact of the computer on the newspaper business. There is what is called the Gannett Mojo, the invention of the Gannett Mojo. Gannett is a large newspaper chain in the United States. I believe it's the largest still. And they were, let's say, early pioneers in deciding how to use computers to enhance the newspaper business. Jennifer Carroll has come in here. She's a vice president in charge of these kinds of digital innovations. She's been to MSU frequently to give lectures and workshops on what Gannett has been doing. They've been exploring this, and they were really the one that invented what is called the MOJO, M-O-J-O. And that stands for mobile journalist, the mobile journalist. It means that nowadays, to be a journalist in a community, you can simply grab your laptop, grab your cell phone, operate from a coffee shop someplace, check in with your editor through either instant messaging or through email, pick up your assignments, be out in the community meeting people. Some people never even have to ever go into the office anymore for anything except occasional meetings to meet their superiors and chat with them. And what happens is that they will turn around then and they will be able to use the technology that they have on hand to cover the news in the community without having to be tied to a desk the way you once were. Used to be that you had to be in the newsroom to answer the telephone if anybody wanted to reach you. Well, now the telephone goes with you. The digital world has unhooked people from the physical location that they needed to be to do their work, and it's allowed journalists whose job was anyhow to be out in the community gathering news. It means that they can spend more time in the community. It used to be in the old days, if you were a reporter, your main job was to carry your little notebook with a pen and paper and pencil. They had those little slim notebooks that fit in your vest pocket because it was so handy. And your job would be to interview people and capture the information. You'd write furiously. Some people who were smart learned shorthand so they could take shorthand notes. You had to be very accurate with your quotes. Nowadays, what you do is when you go out to interview somebody, you pull out your cell phone, you interview them on video. That way you have a video clip if you want to use it in your story. At the same time, you've got an audio recording of all of your interview, a permanent recording. You won't get the quotes wrong because you have them captured there on video, and you just have to go back to the right spot on the tape to be able to listen to the quote. And it's a wonderful opportunity to use this enhanced technology to make you more efficient, more effective, and more reliable. So it's really changed the world. It's called backpack journalism. It means that you don't have to have heavy, big, clunky cameras anymore. Early photographers who went out into the community had these huge monsters called 4x5 speed graphics, and they had individual flash bulbs you had to put into the camera in order to take one picture. So if you got that picture, and because the flash bulbs were so often, people often had their eyes closed because they were busy doing this. Well, if you ran out of flash bulbs, you couldn't take any more pictures. There was a limit. The film was expensive. Nowadays, through your cell phone, you can take remarkable photos. We've seen, for the first time last year, the New York Times ran on its cover, on its homepage, and on the front page of the newspaper, an Instagram photo that one of their reporters took because they were not allowed to bring their digital cameras into the locker room. They got a picture of A-Rod on a cell phone. So cell phones are taking the quality type of images now that can be used on the front page of a major newspaper like the New York Times. So this has revolutionized the news business. It makes it possible for people to cover more stories in a shorter period of time with more and more multimedia that they can add into their stories. You can come back and you can strip out the audio clip, put it up as a podcast. You can take the images that you shot, put them up as a slideshow or a series of images. Take the video that you have and either use a slice of it to put up a video clip or save that and combine those interviews with other interviews and do some kind of mini doc in the future that talks about those subjects. So the digital news gathering process has dramatically changed the business. There's another kind of news gathering that the computer allows, which is data-driven reporting. We teach computer-assisted reporting here, CAR, in the School of Journalism. Dave Polson is a real expert in that area. If you're interested, if you have that kind of mindset, if you like statistics in a story and you like data, the computer has revolutionized our ability to gather and transmit that kind of information in the newspaper. I can tell you that I am so old that I remember when it was called precision reporting before the invention of the computer. And that meant that you would capture data. I sent out a survey once to, I was told to expect a 2 to 3% return rate. So I sent out about, I guess it was about 1,000 surveys to farm women in the state of Michigan, asking them for their opinions on 33 multi-part questions. Instead of getting a 5% return rate, I ended up with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of responses, and I had to calculate them all with a hand calculator. That meant that the process was so laborious that news organizations didn't invest very often in doing that kind of work because it took so much time. Now all you have to do is take that data, have somebody input it into an Excel spreadsheet, And you can do sophisticated analysis far beyond what I could do. They can take answers to one question, compare it to another, break it out based on, well, how many are these women under 35 and over 35? They could do you can do the kinds of things with computer-assisted reporting that you simply could never have the time to do if you're stuck trying to do it by hand with a paper and pencil. So that has revolutionized the reporting world. And by having data-driven reporting, what it also means is that you've got an opportunity to add greater validity to your stories. You can take the statistical information that you've gathered and you can offer it to people, and then they can even, in some cases, use it and analyze it and critique it and see whether what you're saying really holds up to scrutiny. Sometimes newspapers are a bit looser with this. We see things where there are unofficial polls. You'll go to a website and you can click the answer on the poll. That's not a scientific poll, because if a group is organized in the community that has a particular point of view or a particular axe to grind, they can get all their people to go in and fill out that poll and skew the results. But it gives you a sort of snapshot in time of what people are talking about and what it is that they have to say. The link that I included in the PowerPoint, that those of you who can see the PowerPoint will be able to click on, takes you to a site called the Las Vegas Sun. And it shows you sort of they were one of the breakthrough newspapers in being able to do multimedia features. What they created that was new, and it's a term that's not on your slide but should be, it's a term called Evergreen Reporting, Evergreen, Evergreen Reporting. Evergreen reporting means that it's something that lives forever. It's like a tree where the leaves never turn brown. In the case of the Las Vegas Sun, they're out there in Las Vegas, and what do they know about people who come to that community, people who enjoy learning a bit more about Las Vegas? They always want to know the history of Las Vegas. Las Vegas has a very colorful history. It was basically created by some mobsters who decided that out there in the middle of the desert, if they could get away with some gambling, they'd be able to create a thriving city. So the Las Vegas Sun used Flash, which is not as popular as it once was, and it's sometimes difficult in some people's browsers, but it was a new technology, a new innovation a few years ago, and they built an interactive Flash site on the history of Las Vegas. You can click on one link and you can watch all those explosions when they get rid of the old hotels. We all like to watch when they put all the dynamite in the buildings and the buildings collapse. So there's a series of those. There's a history of the mob and the mob's role. There's also another report on there about famous entertainers. You can go and watch the Rat Pack with Frank Sinatra, people who helped build Las Vegas as an entertainment capital in the world. Why do they do that? An evergreen report is something that you can have forever. If I'm an advertiser in a daily newspaper that's on paper, that's in print, what can happen is that I put my ad on that sheet of paper, it's in a newspaper, the person arrives, they pick it up from their front porch, they take it in, they're rushed over coffee, they flip through the newspaper. How much time do they spend on my ad? Not necessarily very much. You're hoping that it catches their eye, that it's attractive enough to catch their eye. And then what happens is that the person says, oh, there's a sale on at Meijer's today on something that I need, and that ad was effective in getting me to stop at Meijer in order to be able to pick up that item. But in the Las Vegas Sun, in an online environment with an evergreen story, they can surround that with ads that they're trying to reach maybe the tourists who come to Las Vegas, because they're likely to click on that story. The next day, that newspaper's thrown out in the trash or headed to recycling, and nobody's ever going to see that ad again. But the investment in an evergreen story in a newspaper that stays online forever means that people can go back to that. It can be available to a new audience 24/7 for as long as the server stays functioning. So if I'm an advertiser who wants you to come to my casino, I would be smart to sponsor an ad or put a display ad at the top of that page to be able to say, okay, you're interested in the mobsters, come and see. We've got some artifacts from when Bugsy Siegel used to come to our casino, and stop in and see those. And that's going to hit an audience anytime that they tap in. The beauty of online newspapers is that you're not as dependent as you once were on having that physical newspaper in your hand. Especially what happens to people, as we see, is that so often people kind of actually feel guilty. They get the newspaper every day, they pull it in from the porch, but they don't read the whole thing. So they stack it over there and say, I'm going to get to that later. but they don't always get to it later, so a lot of advertisers are concerned that they're buying advertisements that people will never see. The other thing that newspapers can do nowadays that they could not do in the past is they can be interactive. They can use social media to extend the reach of the news organization into the community. And this operates as a two-way street for information. It means that, as I often see in the morning, Megan Holland, who is the managing editor of MLive, she tries to reach a local audience with the news that they're covering in Lansing. They don't have a physical newspaper for Lansing. The State Journal covers this area, but MLive is trying to break into this market with their digital news. So she'll go on Facebook and she'll say, we just posted a story about this. What do you think? What's your opinion? And first thing that will happen is she'll get some feedback immediately below on Facebook from people who read the article and give her some feedback, so she can gauge the level of interest. She can compare day to day how many comments she gets from people. If she gets 2 comments on that posting one morning and the story she posts the next day gets 80 comments, she can tell that somehow the first story maybe missed the mark in terms of general interest. The second story worked real well. Sometimes people will give her additional information in the comments that they put on Facebook. They'll say, oh, well, I was glad to see you reporting on this, but I happened to drive by and I saw that this also happened. So what you have is what's called crowdsourced news. You have people who are interacting on social media who give reporters and editors feedback that gives them tips on news stories, additional things they need to know about the stories they're already reporting on, new angles, new ideas that they may not have thought of. It turns news from reporting as a one-way street where the experts tell the community what they've found to being a conversation. And the conversation can occur on Twitter, it can occur on Facebook. It's an opportunity for this to be a two-way conversation about what is happening in the community. This adds to the trustworthiness between the reporters and the people that follow them. It helps to build relationships. What we see is that relationships are extremely important as social media takes a greater role in our life. People come to trust Megan as the source of their news, as the face of that newspaper. And what it also does is a unique kind of branding. We saw, and we will see when we start talking about movies, for example, when they first created movies, nobody had any idea they were going to create what was called the movie star. The person who was everybody liked to see Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks, so they would go to a movie just because they were in it. So what we would see was that this was the creation of the movie star, the person who had their own personal brand. Reporters are now building a personal brand in a way they didn't before. In a print newspaper, only the most astute readers ever noticed who the person was that did the reporting. But online, quite frequently what you see is you see a picture of the reporter, there's a link to that person's name, you may sign up and follow them on Twitter, you may sign up and follow them on Facebook. You begin to think of them as your friend and you begin to think of them as the face of that publication. So one of the big changes as we've added social media into the mix for newspapers when it moved into the digital world is that it's interactive and branded with the individuals who write for the publication. The publication itself wants to protect its brand, but it also has a stable of writers who develop their own followings. We talked a lot in this class, too, about citizen journalism, both paid and unpaid. There are tremendous opportunities right now for people who are interested in delivering the news to communities to figure out how to reinvent this and do it in a way that really is a new type of taking full advantage of the digital environment with the opportunities for more data, with the opportunities for a two-way conversation, with opportunities to build more trust. It means citizen journalism is that people in the community can start covering the news and sharing it with their neighbors. A few years ago, I started watching a blog out of Chicago. A friend of mine says, take a look at this. A friend of mine lives in a place in Chicago called Wicker Park. Nice, discreet neighborhood that has its own character, its own sense of community. And what happened was a cranky old guy in the neighborhood who was retired bought himself a flip camera. Those cameras sort of the precursor to the cell phone camera. And he would sit there in the neighborhood and he would listen to the police scanner all day. And any time the police scanner went off and said, there's a fire over here, or there's a cop car over here, he would grab his little flip camera and he would run out in the neighborhood and he'd grab some shaky footage as he tried to hold that camera steady. He'd see what happened, he'd run back, he'd put it up on YouTube, and he'd put it on his blog. He built up one heck of a following because everybody in the neighborhood liked watching old Charlie, or whatever his name was, run around the community with his flip camera and come back and give you all the news. You could tap in at night and see everything that happened during the day while you were gone. And it was fascinating. I mean, I started watching Charlie myself. Pretty soon, it didn't take long for Charlie to get some competition. All of a sudden, there were other cranky old people in the community who had the time to do this, and they found out how cheap a $100 flip camera was. And pretty soon, they were out in the community. I think it ended up that there were 6 or 7 blogs in Wicker Park, the neighborhood in Chicago, all competing for each other. And some of them survive. Some of them find an economic model that at least provides the person who does it enough to pay for their server space or maybe make a few dollars on the side. But what we're also seeing now is a new era where traditional media are using citizen media as sort of their raw material. When the ice storm hit in Lansing, and well, not everybody's, but a whole hundreds of thousands of people's power went out across the community, across mid-Michigan. There were some of us who still had power. We still had the ability to get out and get places. We were not trapped yet. The ice storm didn't impact all of us equally. And it meant that a citizen journalist like me could go to the press conference that the mayor held on the Saturday after the storm, and I could cover that and put it on my website, and other news organizations could also tap in and watch the videos. It was almost the same as being there. We're using technology now, I hope, for the webcast to be able to be visible to people, or at least you can see it if you want to on the YouTube link that I'll send you later. It's a substitution of having somebody act as the citizen journalist, go out there and gather news that a news organization might not be able to do. The challenge for a lot of news organizations in the community was that when that ice storm hit, it was the holiday weekend. It was before Christmas. A lot of news organizations had given as many people as possible the opportunity to go home and see their families. Many of them were out of town. They were out of state. You couldn't even call them back to do the reporting. So editors were trying to cover things themselves and run out to meetings. But if you have a good relationship with the citizen journalists in the community and you know where all those sites are, you can go to those websites and see the information and the news that those people have gathered. There's a new emphasis, and my friend, one of my colleagues here, is very interested in this. How do you verify what those people tell you? You have to develop standards for the kind of reporting that your citizen journalists do. It's very important to have accurate information. You don't want to rely on somebody who's unreliable. So one of the new things going forward that I think schools of journalism and researchers here will try to focus on is how we help news organizations verify the citizen journalism information that flows to them. There are interactive programs like Storify.com, STORIFY.com, where you can go to Storify and it gives you an easy interface to find out what people are saying on Twitter, what people are saying on Facebook. You can put in the name of your city and you can put in the news headlines, and it'll pull all that information for you. It'll show you the pictures people are putting up on Instagram or Flickr. It'll show you what people are saying on Twitter and what people are saying on Facebook. It has a wonderfully easy interface where you just drag and drop that information into a template and you can create a story as you go from a variety of citizen sources. News organizations are starting to integrate these kinds of tools into their coverage. You'll see if you go to the Storify site that major traditional news media are writing stories on Storify using nothing but social media. Sometimes they repeat the information in their publication, sometimes they just publish the Storify story on Storify. The goal nowadays is to make yourself the go-to place in the community for the latest news, the most in-depth news, the best news in the community. And so you're exploring all these new digital tools, trying to make things happen in a new way. Twitter, we are now here on Ustream. News organizations are taking another look at webcasting. I can go out as I did a couple years ago. There was a protest at the Capitol, and because they had a fairly strong Wi-Fi signal from there, and I had a good cell phone, I was able to pick up and get a decent enough signal over my cell phone. I think I was ended up on data roaming, where I could use a Ustream plugin on my cell phone, and I could webcast from the steps of the Capitol. And I could interview people on the spot, and I could have that information, because I have an embed right in my website. People come to my website, they see the little box for Ustream, and they could see me at the Capitol interviewing people in real time over that webcast. This is a free service that they offer. I wish I made enough money with my site to afford the paid service. It's better, but for the time being, it's good enough. And what it means is when I do my radio show Monday nights down at LCC Radio, I take this same rig that I'm using today with me when I do the show, and I go down there and I webcast the radio show at the same time so people can tap in and see people. It also means that if I press the right buttons at the end, I end up with a YouTube video that I can post. And I've noticed that in addition, people who can't listen to the radio show at 7 o'clock in the evening on Monday, at least a couple hundred of them will watch it the next day as a YouTube in the morning. I apologize, however, because last night we had some technical difficulties and I forgot to hit the second button and never ended up with the webcast video, right? And it was a really good show on the Enbridge protesters who were facing a couple years in prison, a couple years in jail. We are already enough into the digital era to see some things that have worked for news that are starting to fade. A few years ago, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, the hot item in news gathering online were forums. One of the most popular forums, Jennifer Carroll, I told you about, who came in from Gannett, she had told a story about, their most successful forum online was the Mommies Forum, right? Moms at home with babies. Why would that be such a good forum? Because you're stuck at home with nobody to talk to except an infant or a 1-year-old or 2-year-old, and their vocabulary is a little limited, so you might get a little bit squirrely after a few days of only talking to the baby, and you want to talk to another adult human being. So you tap into online, you go to the forum, and the other thing is, in the old days, when we look back sort of historically at some of these trends, a young mother in the neighborhood usually had a situation where she lived close to her family. Aunts and uncles, grandmothers, they were there to offer information and advice on how to take care of the baby. And if not, there were other young mothers in the neighborhood, and many of them, they would do what was called a coffee clatch, where they would get together in the morning, and they'd often bring their babies with them, and they'd say, what do we do? What is this? Oh, that's called cradle cap, and you have to use this kind of shampoo. And they'd trade information and advice on rearing infants and all this lore about child care. And it was a nice community that they built. But now what we have are atomized and isolated individuals in many cases who live far away from family. They may live in a neighborhood where there are very few other women who have young children. Most women in the community work, and if you're the only stay-at-home mom in the community, you can feel kind of isolated. But what's beautiful about the internet is that kind of niche audience, that narrow slice, that's somebody that you can find. It may not be the person who lives 3 doors down so you can get together for coffee, but you can go into a forum together that says Mom's Forum, and you can go there and you can say, here's my Instagram picture of this little weird stuff on the baby's head. What is that? And the mom over there, who might be in Dubuque, Iowa, says, oh, that's cradle cap, and here's what you do for that. They can share information. They can share links to other sites that have professional and expert information. This is also served to be a real treasure trove for advertisers. If I was trying to sell a $500 Aprica stroller, I would want to be on that Mom's Forum. I would want to have those moms saying good things about my stroller. I would want to have a person who did my social media that tapped in every day and saw if somebody said, boy, those strollers, the wheel fell off, and they weren't very good about sending me a new one. Boy, I'd want to take care of that right away. So what we also see is that these become, anytime you have news that is attached to an obvious source of advertisement, that's what newspapers have thrived on for years. What it means now as well, because there's now a whole nest of mommy bloggers that sit on top of this, we see the mommy bloggers have somewhat taken over the functions of the forum. We see people have their favorite mommy bloggers that they go to. One of the more interesting things we talk about the role of government regulation. What happened with the mommy bloggers and others, was that the federal government, through the Federal Communications Commission, decided that it was important that you knew if a blogger was recommending something, you needed to know whether they had a financial relationship with the advertiser. If I say that this brand of stroller is much, much better than that brand of stroller, you need to know if the brand I'm recommending sent me a free stroller, or they pay me $100 a month to mention their stroller at least once a week in a positive way. So what you do see nowadays was that the Federal Communications Commission was so concerned about the power of bloggers and this undisclosed relationship that you now have to disclose that at the bottom of the blog. If you have a financial relationship with the advertiser, with the person, the product or service that you're mentioning, you have to reference that somewhere in the blog, usually down at the bottom, and say, I have a financial relationship with this company. The idea was to make it transparent. The irony, of course, is that news organizations try to be really, very rigorous in making sure that their columnists don't sneak in recommendations to things where they have a financial relationship, but they won't run into trouble with government regulations. Remember, our First Amendment provides special protections to newspapers, physical newspapers, that it does not provide to a blog. So even though the editors may want to make sure that there's none of these hidden relationships and conflict of interest, they don't have to worry about running afoul of the FCC if one sneaks through. In the case of bloggers, bloggers have to be transparent. Let's see. Another one that's kind of fallen by the wayside, we had a wonderful experiment here, are wikis. Wikis were popular. We see Wikipedia survives. Wikis have had a checkered history. The biggest and largest have survived, but a lot of news organizations once tried wiki experiments in their community. We still have a Lansing wiki that a friend of mine runs, where he's been trying to find a niche for that as a place where people would go to share news, but what we've seen is that social media has taken over that role in many cases. Wikis are different than other kinds of media because I can edit your copy. If I'm given permissions, the idea is that everybody can go in and make enhancements, improvements, corrections on each other's copy in a wiki. The good news is that it makes it editable by everybody, so that if I go in and see a typo, I can fix it. If I see that they have a statistic wrong just because they wrote it wrong, I can go in and fix it. But it also means that people who have a particular bias can go in and try to change things to their point of view. People can, as a prank, go in and change information and make it wrong. They've had to tighten up on some wiki rules. Wikis got a sort of bad reputation at first because of that, and what we saw were that its reliability with the community was in question. People said, well, wait a minute, if anybody can change that and they could make it wrong till somebody finds that and corrects it back, then how do I know that I can trust what's on the wiki? There has been some research that suggests that, for example, the old Encyclopedia Britannica, about 15% of the information in there was of dubious value or had some errors in it, and that was about the error rate on Wikipedia. But if you stop to think about it, 15% is a fairly high error rate. And so if you happen to be going to the kinds of contentious articles on controversial subjects, sometimes it means they have to lock them down and not allow people to change them. And that sort of defeats the purpose of a wiki to begin with. So we've not seen wikis. We've already been into this digital revolution long enough to see some sort of casualties along the way. So some of these tools have changed. The big issue in digital newspapers nowadays, I think, is the comment section. It's the issue of trolling. There was an excellent article that appeared over the weekend. I may make it a forum topic next week, where there's a concern that women are not always participating as fully in social media as they might because of some stalkers that follow them and make threats. If you allow anonymous comments where people can comment on the things that you post online, the danger in that is that what happens is that then people can say things without any accountability. And they can say things that, as this one woman talked about, somebody said that they were going to find her at home and cut her head off. It's the kind of thing that chills conversation. It's the sort of thing that women take very seriously because of their personal safety issues. So what we're seeing is that we want to make sure women can participate in the conversation. So women are beginning to write articles about how can we deal with this. One of the more interesting suggestions that people often make is, well, then just shut down your Facebook or Twitter account. But you know, nowadays, especially if you want to be a journalist, you have to be part of those conversations. You can't just simply shut down your Twitter account and be able to compete as a journalist. And journalists have always had the problem, and because they are sort of mini celebrities, that they attract unfortunate attention from people who are unstable, or even people who are just being pranksters without realizing the damage that they're doing when they make those kinds of comments. Now in this digital era where people can comment anonymously, we're seeing a push towards what are called authenticated identities. More and more they're asking you to sign up and comment through Facebook, and they're not giving you an opportunity to comment otherwise. The idea is that you will be held more accountable if you're publishing your comments under your real name. Some people are still willing to malign people and make nasty comments, but you tend to see the violent comments disappear because people don't want to be traced back. That could be illegal, that could be threats that they're making that could cause them trouble with the law. So we're seeing a push on the web. It was originally the Wild Wild West, and it was originally that most people had a screen name that they were urged to be somewhat anonymous. You didn't want to necessarily identify who you are. But through social media, that attitude has changed, and we're now seeing more and more strategies to try to do what are called authenticated identities online. It tends to improve the comments. Another big change that we're seeing with news sites are places like Dig and Reddit, very popular sites where people are exchanging news and information, and it's the community that decides what's important. They can vote you up, they can vote you down. So over time, you have a new posting that you put on a site like Reddit, and people are really excited about it. You get a lot of votes, and you go ch-ch-ch-ch, and pretty soon you're on the home page, and maybe you're even at the top of the home page, and that means you get an enormous amount of hits. So if you're doing something about, let's say, announcing your new blog, and it has a really great post on it, you'll get enormous traffic because Reddit will refer that traffic to the link that you put in your posting. As people who want to see the article see it, and other people post new material that then becomes popular, yours sinks in the ratings as other sites get upvoted. There's a new site called Upworthy, and it's suggesting that this is a topic that's trending now. We see trending topics on Twitter, things that have a sort of lifespan. In the case of Upworthy, it's a group of professionals who are curating the news. Curation is a term you need to know. Aggregation and curation. Aggregation means that you gather together information from other websites and offer it to people. The Drudge Report, from a conservative perspective, is really just a collection of links. Matt Drudge makes a fortune on his website with a very small staff, 1 or 2 people that work for him. And what he does is he scours the news that interests him from his perspective, and he posts links. And people who think the way he does tap into his site every day to see what's interesting, what's happening. And it's just an aggregation of links. Huffington Post also does that from the liberal side. But then there is also curation. What Drudge is doing is he's not throwing up every link on a topic. He is picking the topics that matter to him, and he adds his own headline. Sometimes his headlines are far more interesting than the headline on the actual story. If you are adding your personal taste and you are adding something to it, then it moves from simple aggregation into curation. You're like a curator at a museum, picking what you're going to put into your exhibition. So those are 2 new digital terms that we talk about in this new online environment. So what you try to do is you can build a whole site out of just bringing together other people's news. Matt Drudge, it's not unusual for him to get 1 million hits a day on sometimes when there's huge breaking news. Most news organizations keep him on a little tab so that they can check and see what Drudge is talking about now, because he's pretty good at ferreting out what's starting to become part of the national conversation in the country from a conservative perspective. So aggregation and curation, those are new tools that we're using to bring organized news to people from other sites. And it's kind of interesting that Matt does not have to go out and do any of his own reporting. His reporting is really finding those new kinds of news that he can bring to people. He also scours international news on the same thing. There are also a variety of different kinds of widgets, sites that have new technical capacities or new things that you can do. One of the ones that, as we talked about with verification that we're seeing, these are websites devoted to telling you whether what you're seeing in a news site is true or not. There are sites like PolitiFacts where if the president makes a statement in the State of the Union speech that he's going to give tonight, they will check that statistic and then they will publish a meter that says whether it is liar, liar, pants on fire, or absolutely true. And they'll try to do that as quickly as possible in real time to tell you whether people are telling you the truth in the news. They're a verification system. If President Obama says that unemployment is going down, they will verify whether that fact is true and whether his statistics are accurate. And if there is another way to look at it, they'll try to give you a little bit of background very quickly so that you can analyze from their perspective whether what that person is saying is true. So there are these verification sites. There are new niches that are opening up for people who care about various aspects of the news. They can go into these kinds of sites. So there are new sites that sit on top of other kinds of news sites. Can't even see my own slide here, so I'm going to try to take a look. Hang on just a sec. Yeah, PolitiFacts, all right. One of the other fading ones is an RSS feed. If you have a favorite blogger, it used to be that you would sign up for their RSS feed. It's a handy way that you would get information every time they posted a new blog. What we're seeing now is that tech companies are investing in things and then abandoning them. What just happened a few weeks ago was that Google had an RSS feed aggregator for you where you would use Google Reader. You'd sign up for the sites that you were interested in. Google Reader would gather all those RSS feeds for you, so all you had to do was go to Google Reader and you could read all the headlines in different categories. But then Google decided they're not going to support that anymore. Oops, too bad. All of you who relied on Google Reader, it's gone. One of the dangers with the web right now is that many tools that people found handy are disappearing. It can be that the company just finds out Google thought it would turn out to be a valuable product for them to invest in. And what they found out was they couldn't figure out a good way to monetize it. They could not really figure out a way to make money out of that Google Reader. It wasn't giving them enough search income, and so they abandoned supporting it. That means people who were dependent on it are now kind of out of luck. The same thing is happening with Google Alerts. Google Alerts allows you to go in and you can sign up for different search terms, and they will bring you headlines all day long. You can set up how many times a day you want it to be updated, and they will scour the web for you. Google would scour the web for you. So say you were interested in extension of unemployment insurance. You could sign up for a Google Alert and you would, maybe you set it up to update 3 times a day. You'd go in and check and you'd find headlines from all over the United States on that topic. Google has now sort of abandoned that, not officially. They haven't killed it off outright as they've done with Google Reader, but they're not putting resources in it. Used to be you'd see 50 links. Now you're seeing 3 or 4. So part of the challenge in this digital world is that you become dependent on tools or websites that you really love, and then they disappear, sometimes without warning. There have been sites where you go and you put up your free website. Posterous was one. It was a competitor to Tumblr. Posterous did not do very well. Posterous, I guess they called it. I had friends who spent a lot of time putting up their blog on Posterous, only to wake up one day and get the notice that Posterous has gone out of business. The sites are wiped off the server, they're gone. If you didn't get a chance to download it in the 24 hours that they gave you, all of the work that you'd put in had disappeared. So part of the challenge nowadays is knowing which tools you can rely on and which tools are ephemeral and may not be there when you need them the next time. I had a clicker question for you, but guess what? I'm not going to ask it. And there's one more question I'm going to ask from that section. That is not a very good opportunity with some people watching on the webcast, so we'll do that later. I'm now going to go through and close, because I think it's very hard on a webcast to listen to too long of a lecture. But I'm going to go through the historical periods in the history of the newspaper. We've talked now about the digital innovation, sort of recent news on newspapers. But let's go back, because one of the things, remember, that we try to do with each new medium is get a sense of the history of where did it come from. What makes this class different than some of the other intro to mass media type classes is we look at the history and not just the present day reality. So we were talking about, there's a slide that you'll find if you go under the Lessons tab on Angel, download that PowerPoint. You'll see that there are various historical periods that are broken down there in terms of the history of newspapers in the United States. It begins with the pre-revolutionary period that ended in 1784. 1784. My eyes are old, I couldn't see it. The post-revolutionary period, 1785 to 1833. then the penny press, then the industrialization of the press, the ascendance of editorial and news departments, tabloids, and the real heyday of the newspapers, press dominance, which was sadly only about a 5-year period from 1950 to 1955. What happened in 1955 that ended the dominance of the newspaper? TV. TV became and is now still the greatest source of news for most people in the United States, though the internet is catching up pretty quickly because a lot of TV news goes on the internet. But what we see in these different eras, and we'll go through them briefly, is that pre-revolutionary period. I guess maybe the person that we think of as a really sort of the symbol of that era is Benjamin Franklin. This is 1686 to 1784. Benjamin Franklin wrote under a variety of pseudonyms or pen names or nom de plume. It means fake names that people use to hide their identity. We don't think very much of that practice nowadays. Ben Franklin would be in a lot of trouble with the Society for Professional Journalists for using a fake name for different kinds of articles. But he wrote under the name Silence Dogood, I believe it was. Was it Silence Dogood? Yes, Silence Dogood in the New England Current. So he wrote these opinion columns, and he was very politically active, and he tried to persuade people from his point of view. Think of him as either the Ed Schultz or the Rush Limbaugh of his day. I'm not sure which one he was. I think we can't apply today's political labels to people back in the Revolutionary period. But what he had was his own printing press, and he was able to publish these broadsides and get his political point of view out there. So this was a very important period of time that newspapers really gained and became a flourishing industry in the United States. Those of you who might have had the opportunity to take a look at things like the old series Deadwood that was on HBO, they had a local newspaper publisher, and you can see what an important person that person was in the community because they shaped in many ways the way in which they put a frame around the news for the community. We look at the post-revolutionary period, and it was both a political press, talking about politics. It was a mercantile press, a lot of business news. Business news remains important. We saw the stock market plunge, 300 points in one day recently. That spreads into the news very quickly. People want to know what's happening with their money. They want to know what's happening with their jobs, with their incomes, and so political and mercantile news were very important parts of the overall mix. And we also see in that non-mainstream news. During this post-revolutionary period, that was when we saw the rise of the African-American press. There have always been newspapers that cater to niche audiences, even in the print era. My grandmother came to this country from Lithuania, and every day I would see when I would go to her house, she would have coffee in the morning, and she would be reading the newspaper, the Vilna News, that came from the old country, written in Lithuanian because that was her national language. It was the language in which she was the most comfortable. So we've always seen news organizations that filter the news through the perspectives of particular audiences. Then we see the rise of the penny press. That is really sort of the first newspaper for the common person. This was the one that really widely disseminated. First of all, it was cheap enough that people could go ahead and afford it. If it was a few pennies to buy a copy of the newspaper, you could afford to buy it. The other thing that happened is that society was changing. The Industrial Revolution meant that people had jobs in factories where they were now making a reliable income so that they could afford to be able to buy a newspaper. In urban areas, the distribution system were newsboys who stood on the corner and hawked the paper for a few pennies. And they'd be sure to have an edition that would be ready as people were let out of the factories, so that when you were on your way home from work, you could pick up a copy easily from the newsboy on the corner. So they handled the problem of distribution by making it easy in urban areas. Most of the big newspapers were cities would have multiple newspapers, 6 or 7 newspapers competing for your pennies. In addition to the pennies being able to support the publication of the newspaper, they were heavily dependent on advertising. So they put in the kind of news that was quick to grab your eye so that the advertisers were quick to advertise in their newspaper and not the competitors. Mostly these were for local products that were available in the community, things that you could buy. Some were still for national products. Coca-Cola would still advertise in newspapers because they didn't have any alternatives. Once they had television, it turned out to be much more reliable for them to be able to gather a national audience through TV. These were the first newspapers to use reporters. The staff size of the newspaper grew. It wasn't just one person like Benjamin Franklin going out and gathering the news and printing and publishing it for you. It was being able to hire people. They were making enough money to hire reporters whose sole job it was to go out into the community. Remember when we talked the other day about the rise of magazines? Magazines really didn't get their start until there was a class of professional reporters out there who could make a living at learning how to write well enough and attract people and write engagingly enough and take photographs and do those things. That was what gave that pool of talent so that magazines could get their start. These kinds of newspapers were kind of tabloidy. They focused a lot on crime news, courts, society news, high society. They'd show you the fancy dress balls and talk about the people who were there. They would also engage in some hoaxes. There was a newspaper called the New York Sun, for example, that ran a little series called Life on the Moon. They stopped running the series. They never admitted it was a hoax, but it sold quite a few newspapers for them. The social changes in the United States coincided with that rise of the penny press. As we moved to the Industrial Revolution, it changed society here in the United States. We saw a growing immigrant population that was coming to this country to feed the factories with labor, growing population. I offer some maps there that take a look at the changes in the westward expansion of the United States. The urban areas had multiple newspapers competing for your eyeballs, but in the rural areas, to get your hands on a newspaper still was often meant it was mailed to you, or we saw things like the horseback riders, the postal press, where the horseback riders would take the pouch of news from one community to another. There was a time, for example, when Lincoln was elected, that it took months for that news to reach the West, for those newspapers to finally be delivered. There were people who lived in isolated rural areas that didn't find out who would win the presidential election for a couple months, because it would take that long for the news to filter through. So those are one of the changes. The penny press was also possible because printing presses were getting faster. You could produce more pages, you could bind them together. There was greater improvement in transportation, so you could distribute those newspapers more easily after they had been printed. The communication technology was advancing. We were seeing the telegraph. The telegraph was invented in 1844. It went transcontinental in 1861. This is Civil War time. Now, the telegraph is credited with being the invention of one of these great journalistic inventions, and that's called the inverted pyramid of news. Remember, the news is 5 W's and an H. Who, what, why, where, when, and how. So you've got 5 W's and an H. You're trying to gather the basic facts. When they invented the when they invented the telegraph, it meant that if I was out there covering a battle in the Civil War, I could rush into the local telegraph office and I could write out my headlines to my article, my facts to my article, to be transmitted back to my newspaper in New York, maybe, that had the money to invest in that kind of technology. And what I would do is I would, have the telegraph operator transmit that information. And then my editor would take that information and turn it into a story for that day's newspaper. The telegraph, however, just like any new technology when it comes on board, it was somewhat unreliable. So the telegraph would go down fairly frequently. It's like the old days when you'd be watching TV and the picture would disappear. Or the old blue screen of death on Windows where you'd be typing along and all of a sudden everything would disappear off your computer screen. Well, the inverted pyramid meant that if you used that approach to the news, you put the most important information first, so that as the telegraph operator was transmitting that to your editor, if the line went down, at least you had a fighting chance that most of the important news had already been transmitted. So that meant that you didn't start out with, well, it's kind of a hazy day here at the battlefield and the clouds are gathered, because that isn't really the essential information that your editor needs to have to write the story. So the inverted pyramid is a visual representation of putting the most important news at what is the base of the pyramid that's now flipped over and put on top, because you put your basic facts at the top. And many news stories reflected that approach. They were top heavy with the basic facts. The other reason that that happened is when you flowed copy onto the newspaper pages, it's not like it is now where it was easy to redo and switch things and edit things. This was type that was set in lead. And it meant that people who were called linotype operators were punching in these words. They had to be able to type backwards to see if it was okay. So the ideal is that if all of a sudden a new piece of breaking news came in, you would literally break the news. You would have your article that you had just done with the important facts at the top, sort of extraneous facts down at the bottom. If a new piece of news came in you wanted to put on the home page of your newspaper, on the front page of your newspaper, you broke off the news on the bottom and you shoved in that news story. So it was an opportunity to organize the news in ways that made both the transmission of the news through the telegraph and the layout of the news on the page more likely to get the most important information to the reader one way or the other. I'm going to skip over some of this. Remember also that literacy was increasing in the United States at this time. It means that people were more likely to be able to read the newspaper. It became increasingly important. We had public education, those famous one-room schoolhouses all across the country being able to educate people so that they became newspaper readers. The coverage of the Civil War dramatically changed the news. We had this new technology. We had the money that the news industry was generating to be able to invest in some of this. But at the same time, I put up, and you'll see in your slides, some photographs from Matthew Brady. Matthew Brady was, whoops, that's my phone. We'll ignore it. Matthew Brady was not a photographer, or he was not the person who took all those photographs of the Civil War himself. Matthew Brady was a news image broker. He bought those Civil War photographs from a number of photographers who were shooting the Civil War on the front lines. The technology had reached the point now where news organizations could put images in their newspapers. And what happened was when Brady's pictures showing dead bodies on the battlefield appeared, that changed a lot of people's attitudes about war. It was a breakthrough in news reporting because before you would write about war, but it was almost abstract because words didn't convey the same kind of emotion as seeing all those dead bodies on the battlefield in the Civil War, most horrendous war really, and the devastating war in the history of this country. And the government began to realize that it was harder to maintain enthusiasm for the war if you had people turning against it because of those visual images. They also put increasing pressure on news organizations not to reveal details of their war strategies. So we began to see Lincoln, censoring newspapers more in that era than we had seen previously. So we saw the rise of the tensions between government trying to censor the news and the people in the news industry trying to get that information to people. The industrialization of the press, I think those slides are self-explanatory. As the population grew, what we became was a consumer society. We are now a nation where our economy our whole entire economy is dependent on consumer spending. And so advertising, trying to get messages to people to buy products and to buy services becomes increasingly important and highly competitive. In the era when the newspaper was really the only vehicle for advertising, newspapers in some ways, they almost say they had a printing press in the basement that could print money, basically, because they were the only place you could go if you wanted to get information about your product on. It allowed for the development of different columnists. I gave you the example of H.L. Mencken, people like that, who wrote about the news or wrote about the society in engaging ways. It built up a stable of personalities. Naaman Runyon in the tabloid era. Tabloids relied on sensationalism. Please check out the slides in the PowerPoint because there is an example there. It was a photograph taken by a reporter who hid a camera on his shoe. And he went in and took a picture of a woman being executed in the electric chair. And it was put on the front page of a New York tabloid. And it's a very controversial photo. It was probably the last of its kind ever to be published that way. On the one hand, everybody wanted to see it, and so it boosted sales. On the other hand, so many people were revulsed by seeing that graphic and image on the front page of a newspaper that we have not seen. We've seen standards and taste and ethics change in the newspaper business over time, and that kind of tabloid sensationalism is not as popular as it once was. We'll talk a little bit about the dominance of the news business in the 50s in closing. That was when newspapers really hit their heyday. In many communities, the number of newspapers had settled down into a one or two newspaper town. Urban areas, major urban cities might have even more than that. And we still see New York City that supports a number of tabloids in addition to the New York Times. But it was a very lucrative industry. Prior to the advent of television, they were the place you went to for news. We had a very different kind of society, with manufacturing being the source of so many jobs and office jobs. It was the traditional 8 to 5 society. Could mean 7 to 3 if you worked in a factory and you were one of the 3 shifts. If you worked in an office, it was 8 to 5. It was when dad was the only one in the family working. Not as many women were in the workforce. Women were at home with the children. The newspaper came in the morning, you read it before you went to work. You got home in the evening, you had dinner, you read the newspaper. If you were the man of the family, you read it after dinner and sat there and read the newspaper. That was part of what you did. It was a daily sort of ritual. Very loyal newspaper readers. It has always been a prevailing part of the culture. How we're reinventing that for a digital era is still something that we're working out. I think you're very lucky in your generation, those of you that want to be journalists, because you have an opportunity to create this whole new future. People want news. They need to know what's happening, not just on their block and in their community, but literally around the world. You need to know what's going on in the Ukraine. You need to know what's going on in Kiev. You're going to be following the Olympics in Sochi. You're going to learn an awful lot more about the Caucasus and places like Dagestan, where the families of the alleged Boston bombers came from. We're increasingly a connected digital society, and we're relying on reporters, both citizen journalists and paid professionals, to tell us what's going on. And you'll have an opportunity to participate in building that whole new world. And so I hope to see everybody on Thursday. It should be a heat wave by then. It'll be 20 degrees, and I'll see everybody then. Thank you.